They called me ungrateful. But what would you do if you found out your family was using your name, your money, and your silence to keep their lies alive? On Christmas morning, my father demanded an apology. Instead, I handed him proof of every dollar they stole. That night, I froze their cards, their cars, and their pride. When the truth hit the news, even the snow outside our house couldn't cover the shame. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The snow had already started to fall when I turned onto Harbor Drive, the long street that led to my parents' house on Mercer Island. It wasn't heavy yet. Just that soft, steady kind that covered everything in white and made you think life might still be peaceful for a minute. The house looked exactly the same as it did the last time I saw it 2 years ago, glowing with Christmas lights. Wreaths on the doors, the illusion of warmth behind the glass. Funny how the place looks the same, but nothing feels familiar. I parked in the driveway beside a brand new white Tesla that definitely hadn't been there before. The sight made my stomach twist, though I couldn't explain why just yet. I took a deep breath, straightened my coat, and walked up the steps. The front door opened before I could knock. Emily. "You finally made it." My father's voice filled the doorway before he did. Richard Carter. 63, retired real estate developer, still carrying himself like a man who owned the block. His gray hair was neatly combed, his sweater too crisp for comfort. "We were starting to think work replaced family for you." "Work doesn't argue over dessert," I said, forcing a smile. He chuckled, not catching the edge in my tone. Still sharp as ever. Inside, the smell of pine and cinnamon hung in the air. My mother, Elaine, glided from the kitchen like she was hosting a magazine shoot. "Emily, sweetheart." "Oh, you look thin. You should eat more." She kissed the air near my cheek. "Don't be sarcastic, dear. It's Christmas." And there was Ryan, my younger brother, sprawled on the sofa, his laughter too loud for the size of the room. M. "Look who finally decided to come home." He gestured toward a group of people I didn't recognize. Neighbors, maybe, or investors from his latest business fantasy. "You're just in time. I was telling them about my company, Aurora Tech. We're about to secure a second round of funding. Congratulations," I said flatly, hanging my coat on the rack. The fireplace crackled, and Christmas music played from the speakers, something soft and familiar. Bing Crosby, maybe. Everything sparkled garlands on the staircase, a 12-foot tree candles on every flat surface. My parents had always loved putting on a show, but this year it felt excessive. I caught myself scanning the living room, automatically counting expensive upgrades like I was auditing the place. A new painting over the fireplace, imported rugs, designer furniture, the kind of renovation that didn't come cheap. Dinner was served buffet style. Guests mingled glasses, clinking everyone in their holiday best. I smiled when expected. Answered the same polite questions. Still working at the bank, yes. Still single, no, not lonely. But beneath the surface, something gnawed at me. When I slipped into the kitchen to get a glass of water, I saw it. The smallest detail, but enough. My mother was handing the housekeeper a credit card. I wasn't paying attention until the metallic glint caught my eye. My name was embossed on it, Emily Carter. At first I thought maybe it was an old card of mine she'd grabbed by mistake. But then I remembered I hadn't left any cards here. I'd canceled them years ago after Ryan's last borrowing incident. The housekeeper took it without question, swiping it through the terminal for the catering bill. I felt the air leave my chest. My mother looked up and saw me standing there. "Everything all right, darling?" I forced a smile. "Fine. Just getting some water." She nodded and turned back to her conversation with the caterer. My fingers tightened around the glass so hard I thought it might crack. There it was, my name. Paying for their perfect holiday. I walked back into the living room where my father was laughing with one of his golf friends about the good old days in real estate. Ryan was showing off his watch. Rolex gold. He'd never had a job that lasted longer than 6 months. I stared at him for a second, wondering how much of that money came from me. The sound in the room felt suddenly far away, muffled under the weight of realization. The laughter, the carols, the clinking glasses, it all blurred together. My mother passed by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "Emily, take one. These are from that French bakery you love. Couvent or whatever it's called." "Coq au vin," I corrected softly. But she didn't hear me. "See, my father said to a guest nearby. Our Emily, always the smart one. I wanted to say something, about the card, about the house, about the absurdity of it all, but my words stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. What good would it do? This wasn't the night for honesty. Not here, not with them. So I smiled. I nodded. I played my part. At one point, Ryan pulled me aside. Hey. Em, you think you could look over a few things for me? Some banking documents? Nothing big? Sure, I said, though we both knew I didn't mean it. Later, while everyone gathered around the tree for the traditional toast, I stood by the window instead, watching the snow fall heavier outside. My reflection stared back at me from the glass. Same brown hair, same eyes, just older. Tired. I could see the party behind me in the reflection, my mother's laugh, my father's pride, Ryan's charm. A picture-perfect family. And me outside of it all like a ghost haunting her own past. My father's voice carried through the room. To family, he said, lifting his glass. To the people who always stand by you. To family, everyone echoed. I took my coat from the rack, slipping it on quietly. My mother's voice trailed after me. Leaving already. You just got here. Long day, I said. I'll see you tomorrow. The front door closed behind me with a soft click. Cold air rushed over my face, sharp and clean. The snow covered the yard in white, softening the sharp lines of the world. I walked down the front steps and stopped looking back once at the house. Every window glowing gold laughter spilling out into the night. Home, sweet home, I whispered, and the words tasted bitter. The wind carried away the sound, and for the first time, all evening everything was quiet. The house was quiet when I went upstairs, the kind of quiet that only happens after a night of forced cheer and too much wine. I shut my old bedroom door and leaned against it for a second, listening to the faint hum of the furnace below. My room looked like a museum exhibit from a life I barely remembered. Posters on the wall, old trophies lined up on a dusty shelf, a framed graduation photo of a girl who used to think she understood her family. I sat on the edge of the bed, kicked off my heels, and stared at the suitcase by the door. I hadn't unpacked. Maybe part of me already knew I wouldn't be staying long. The moonlight through the lace curtains made the whole room glow silver. It felt too clean, too staged like everything else in this house. I opened my laptop. The light from the screen hit my face sharp against the dark room. I typed in my bank login more out of habit than suspicion. But as soon as the account summary loaded, something twisted in my gut. The balance was lower than I remembered, much lower. I scrolled down the transaction list, eyes flicking through the numbers. Designer brands, high-end spas, a Tesla dealership in Bellevue, and then one line that made me freeze completely. Aurora Tech seed investment, $50,000. Aurora Tech, Ryan's startup. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd opened the wrong account. Maybe I'd transferred money somewhere by accident, but the pattern was too deliberate. Months of spending that didn't belong to me. $4,500 for handbags, $2,000 for a spa membership, another $6,300 at a furniture store. And every charge linked to one name, Elaine Carter. I clicked into the card details. There it was, secondary cardholder Elaine Carter. My mother. I sat back in the chair, breath catching in my chest. A memory came to me out of nowhere, clear as if it had happened yesterday. Her voice, soft and practiced from a phone call last year. Sweetheart, I just need an emergency card in case of medical bills. You know how these things go at our age. I had believed her. I even felt guilty for hesitating. I'd forgotten all about it until tonight. Now looking at those statements, the lie was staring back at me in bold black font. I clicked through older months. It went back nearly a year. Plane tickets, jewelry, an entire weekend at a spa resort. Thousands and thousands of dollars under my name. And all this time she'd smiled at me like nothing was wrong, serving holiday meals and asking about my job, pretending she didn't know I'd notice someday. The more I scrolled, the colder the room felt. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the 24-hour line at West Bank. The automated voice walked me through the menu options before connecting me to a real person. Thank you for calling West Bank. Customer service. This is Kelly. How can I help you tonight? Hi, I said, trying to sound calm. I just noticed several transactions on my credit account that don't belong to me. I think someone might be using a card under my name. Okay, ma'am. Can I have your full name and card number to verify I gave her the details, tapping my fingers on the desk to keep from shaking? All right, thank you. I see here that the transactions are being made from a secondary card linked to your account. Authorized user, Elaine Carter. Is that correct? I closed my eyes for a second. Yes, that's my mother. So these purchases aren't fraudulent? No, I said quietly. They're not fraudulent. Kelly hesitated. Would you like to remove the secondary user or file a limit adjustment? I hesitated too, staring at the list of charges glowing on my laptop screen. A luxury car boutique, hotels, investment transfers. My family's perfect holiday life, all underwritten by me. Not yet, I said finally. I just needed to confirm. Of course. Is there anything else I can help you with tonight? No, thank you. When the call ended, the quiet came rushing back heavier this time. I sat there for a long moment watching the cursor blink on the screen. My reflection stared back at me, tired eyes, clenched jaw, a face I barely recognized. They didn't just take my money. They took my silence for weakness. The thought came uninvited, and it stayed. I closed the laptop and leaned back, feeling the wooden chair creak beneath me. Outside, the wind picked up brushing snowflakes against the window like soft knocks. The sound was steady, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Down the hall, I heard my father's low voice, probably finishing another drink. My mother's laughter followed light and rehearsed. Ryan's voice somewhere behind hers bragging again. The sound faded, muffled by distance and walls. For years I'd worked to stay out of their chaos, to be the responsible one, the good daughter. The one they could point to when they needed proof the Carters were doing fine. And while they smiled for their friends, I paid the bills. I signed the papers, I made sure the image stayed intact. Not this time. I shut off the desk lamp and stood up. The moonlight was enough to see by. I walked to the window and touched the cold glass. Snowflakes stuck to it, melted, slid down in slow trails. I watched them fall until my thoughts steadied. Tomorrow I'd ask them, politely. That was the plan anyway. But plans don't mean much when the people you're up against have been rehearsing their version of the truth their whole lives. I turned off the laptop, pulled the blanket from the foot of the bed, and lay down without changing. The house creaked in the wind, settling into silence again. My mind wouldn't stop moving, replaying every smile, every compliment from earlier tonight, now painted in a different light. Somewhere downstairs, a clock chimed midnight. I stared at the ceiling, wide awake, the glow from the window reflecting across the room. They had no idea that tonight was the last time any of them would ever spend my money without asking. The smell of pancakes and coffee reached me before I even came downstairs. I could hear my mother's voice floating from the kitchen, bright and rehearsed like she was performing breakfast. I took a deep breath before stepping into the dining room. Sunlight filled the space, bouncing off the polished silverware and the Christmas centerpiece. Everything looked picture-perfect, like a postcard of a family that didn't exist. Richard sat at the head of the table behind a neatly folded copy of the Seattle Times. Elaine was already on her phone, scrolling through something with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Ryan, still in pajama pants and a hoodie, was in the middle of a story about his big investor call coming up next week. "Morning," I said, taking my seat. "Morning, sweetheart." My mother answered automatically, still scrolling. My father grunted behind his newspaper. Ryan just nodded. I poured myself coffee, black, no sugar. My hands didn't shake, but my chest was tight. For a moment I watched them, the perfect Carter morning routine. Dad pretending to read the business section he already knew by heart. Mom pretending not to hear anything uncomfortable. Ryan pretending to be someone important. And me pretending I hadn't seen everything last night. I set the mug down, the sound sharp against the silence. "Mom." "I noticed some transactions on my credit card," I said quietly. "I think there's been a mistake." She didn't even look up. Mistake. "Oh, honey, I've used it for some family purchases." "You're so good with money." My voice stayed calm. "Family purchases?" Ryan laughed, cutting his pancake with unnecessary enthusiasm. "It's all in the family, Em. Lighten up." I stared at him. "Right, because fraud's hilarious. Enough." My father said, lowering his newspaper just enough for me to see his eyes. "This is Christmas morning. No talk about finances at the table." I didn't speak for a moment. The only sound was the quiet ticking of the clock and the hiss of the coffee maker in the background. Then I reached into my folder and placed a few printed statements on the table. Then maybe we should talk about honesty instead. Elaine's eyes flicked to the papers. I watched her face shift. The faint panic, the quick recovery. "Emily," she said softly. "Is this really necessary? It's the holidays. Can we not ruin the day with unpleasantness? What's unpleasant is you using my card to fund your lifestyle and invest in Ryan's company." Ryan stopped chewing. "Hey, I didn't ask for... Save it," I said, turning to him. "You took it. You just didn't bother asking." Richard folded his newspaper, setting it down with deliberate slowness. "Emily," his voice carried the weight of warning. "You will not talk to your mother that way. I'm talking about facts, not feelings." He pushed his chair back and stood. The sudden motion startled even Ryan. "I said that's enough." His tone cut through the room. Mom reached out toward him. "Richard." But he kept going, eyes locked on me. "You've been disrespectful since you walked in this house. You come here once every few years, and the first thing you do is throw accusations at your family. You should be ashamed." I met his gaze without blinking. Ashamed. "Of what? Paying for your furniture, or keeping your image intact while you lecture me about family values?" Ryan muttered. "Geez. Em, you're overreacting." "Overreacting?" I turned toward him. "You're 30, Ryan. Maybe start paying for your own startup before asking Dad for another loan in my name. Enough." My father roared, his hand slamming on the table. The silverware jumped. Elaine flinched. "You will apologize to your mother right now, or you can get out of this house." The silence that followed was thick and heavy like the air before a storm. I looked at him. The man who'd taught me to never raise my voice, who once said control was power. He stood there, trembling, veins visible in his neck, his control long gone. I spoke softly, almost gently. "You don't want an apology. You want obedience." His face reddened. I said, "Apologize." I rose from my chair, taking my time. "You know what's funny, Dad?" My voice stayed calm, level. "Threats only work when you're afraid of losing something," Elaine whispered. "Emily, please." Her voice broke, but I couldn't tell if it was from guilt or performance. "I'm not doing this," I said, sliding the printed papers back into my folder. "Not this year." Richard's eyes flashed. "Then you can leave." I nodded once. "All right." Ryan stood up, half angry, half confused. "You can't just walk out over this. Watch me." I grabbed my coat from the chair. The morning light poured in through the windows, spilling over the hardwood floor. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world unnaturally still. I turned back once at the doorway. My father's hand was still on the table, knuckles white. My mother's phone lay forgotten beside her coffee cup. The screen black. Ryan looked like he didn't know what to say. "Merry Christmas, Dad," I said. My voice didn't crack. It was steady, almost kind. And then I opened the door and stepped into the cold, the silence following me out like a shadow. The wind hit my face sharp and clean, carrying away the heat of the room. The smell of coffee, the sound of my father's anger. I walked down the steps slowly, one hand gripping the railing, the other holding the folder close to my chest. By the time I reached the driveway, the sunlight had turned everything into a blinding shimmer of white. Behind me, the house stood quiet again, picture-perfect as always. Inside, they would probably tell each other I was dramatic, ungrateful, selfish. They'd find words to make me the villain of their story. But for the first time, I didn't care what story they told. I opened my car door, slid in, and let the engine hum to life. The radio came on, some soft carol about peace and forgiveness. I turned it off. As I pulled away, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked steady, cold maybe, but clear. The kind of calm that comes right before everything changes. The snow was falling harder by the time I reached the end of the block. The wind bit at my face, turning every breath into a puff of white mist. I walked without thinking, the sound of my boots crunching in the snow the only rhythm I could hear. Christmas decorations blinked from porches up and down the street. Plastic reindeer, glowing snowman wreaths too perfect to be real. Every house looked like a lie. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't need to look to know who it was, but I did anyway. A text from Ryan. "You really messed up. Dad's furious." I stopped for half a second, the cold biting through my gloves, and stared at the message. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't type anything back. Instead, I powered the phone off and slipped it back into my coat. Silence would be my reply. The snowstorm was getting heavier, wind whipping against my face as I crossed toward the busier part of town. Every few minutes, a car passed headlights glowing like ghosts through the white. I must have looked insane. Hair wet, cheeks red, walking alone on Christmas Day. But I didn't care. For once, I wasn't the one pretending everything was fine. By the time I reached Capitol Hill, my coat was soaked through. The city was quieter than usual, streets blanketed in white. I spotted a small cafe on the corner, the kind that always stayed open no matter what. The Red Lantern. A hand-painted sign in the window read, "Open 24 hours. Warm drinks, no drama." I almost laughed at that last part. Inside, the bell above the door chimed softly. The warmth hit me all at once, making my skin sting. A young barista with bright purple hair looked up from behind the counter. "Rough night?" she asked, eyeing the melted snow dripping off my sleeves. You could say that I said, brushing my hair back. She gave me a sympathetic smile. Coffee large, black. I took a seat in the far corner near the window. The cafe was nearly empty. Just one older man reading a newspaper and a couple whispering at the counter. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world has paused just for you. I set my laptop on the table, the familiar weight grounding me. My hands moved automatically, muscle memory, from years of working in finance. Within minutes, I was logged into Westbridge Bank's secure portal, my personal dashboard filling the screen. The numbers looked the same as last night, but I wasn't here to check balances. I was here to end the game. 6 personal accounts, 2 business-related. I opened them one by one. Each one told the same story. Withdrawals, transfers, purchases. They'd treated my name like a debit card for their convenience. I opened a new tab accessing the internal fraud prevention portal I'd helped design when I was promoted 2 years ago. I knew exactly how to report misuse without triggering an investigation against myself. I flagged each account for high-risk external access. It was technically true. My heart beat steadily, not fast. I wasn't scared, just focused. My fingers hovered over the mouse before I selected the first action freeze account. Immediate effect. The confirmation box popped up. I clicked yes, then another, and another. Each click was clean, final, satisfying. When I reached the secondary cards list, I saw their names again, Elaine Carter and Ryan Carter. I hovered for a moment, staring at the names. My mother's signature had always looked elegant, looping, and confident. My brother's messy, barely legible. Both tied to mine. I hit remove access. A warning flashed on screen. This action cannot be undone. Confirm. Yes. I sipped my coffee, the bitterness grounding me. People think revenge has to be loud, but silence hits harder when they don't see it coming. Outside, the snow swirled faster, the storm thickening. I could barely see across the street now. The Christmas lights from the surrounding apartments flickered like they were struggling to hold their glow. The cursor blinked on the screen as I navigated to the final step. Fraud alerts. I wrote the note in the required box, coldly factual, unauthorized secondary spending detected. Primary account holder requests verification and immediate freeze. Once I submitted it, the message appeared at the top of the screen. All accounts frozen, pending verification. I let out a long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The sound of it fogged the surface of my coffee cup. Steam rose, mingling with my breath in the cold light from the window. "Merry Christmas to me," I whispered. The barista glanced over from the counter. "You say something?" I smiled faintly. Just talking to myself. I sat back, letting the chair creak beneath me. My pulse had slowed, but something inside still hummed. Like the faint vibration of a string pulled too tight. The adrenaline wasn't fading yet. I opened my email, checking to make sure everything was logged. Each confirmation came through instantly. Fraud reports filed, account locks, initiated card cancellations complete. It was done. For 7 years, I'd been the quiet backbone of that family, the one who fixed their mistakes and balanced their chaos. Tonight, I'd finally stopped being their safety net. The cafe door opened, a gust of wind swirling snow across the floor. The couple at the counter left laughing, the sound fading into the storm. The place was nearly empty now, just me and the barista humming to some soft indie song on the radio. I looked out at the street. The lights were blurred through the snow, glowing like something distant and unreachable. My reflection in the window stared back at me, pale but steady. It wasn't guilt I felt. It wasn't satisfaction either. It was something colder, cleaner. Freedom, maybe. I finished my coffee, closing the laptop with a soft click. The sound felt final, like closing a chapter. I should have ended years ago. As I stood to leave, the barista called out, "Hey, you got somewhere warm to go?" "Yeah," I said, "somewhere I should have been all along." The bell above the door chimed again as I stepped outside. The snow hit my face immediately, sharp and relentless. I tightened my scarf and started walking, the wind pulling at my coat. Behind me, the cafe light glowed warm against the storm. Ahead, the road disappeared into white, and for the first time in years, I didn't need to know exactly where it led. By the time the sun broke through the gray clouds that afternoon, the house on Mercer Island was quiet again. Too quiet. The kind of silence that hangs heavy after an argument nobody wants to talk about. Snowlight filled the rooms, bouncing off polished floors and expensive surfaces. My absence sat in that silence, like a ghost. Inside, Elaine Carter was sitting at her vanity, trying to distract herself with the familiar ritual of control. Powder, perfume, pearls. She picked up her wallet and checked her phone. The holiday sale she'd been waiting for popped up on the screen, 40% off at Nordstrom. A moment of comfort. She added a few things to her cart: shoes, perfume, a handbag she'd been eyeing for weeks, and tapped pay. Now, declined. She frowned and tried again. Declined. The little red text on her phone didn't make sense. Her brow furrowed. "Richard," she called out, voice rising with irritation. "Something's wrong with the card." Downstairs, Richard was on his laptop at the kitchen table, glasses low on his nose, a half-empty cup of coffee next to him. "What card?" he asked without looking up. "My card. The Visa," she said. "It's saying declined. I just used it yesterday. Probably the system," he muttered. "Banks are slow on holidays." She tried again, louder this time. "It's not working." Richard sighed, shutting his laptop with a snap. "For God's sake, Elaine, calm down. I'll look into it." Ryan was pacing in the living room, his phone pressed to his ear. "No, I'm telling you the transfer didn't go through," he said to whoever was on the other end. "Yeah, for payroll. Aurora Tech can't process outgoing funds. It's saying access denied." He hung up, his voice pitching higher. "My crypto wallet's locked. What the hell's going on?" Richard glared over at him. "Relax, it's a glitch. It's Christmas, the servers are overloaded." Ryan shook his head, panic edging into his tone. "No, Dad, this isn't a glitch. It's saying restricted access by the primary account holder." Elaine froze. "What does that mean?" Richard frowned and reopened his laptop, typing faster this time. The Westbridge Bank logo filled the screen. He logged into the joint account he'd shared with Elaine for years. Within seconds, an error message appeared in bold red letters. "Account temporarily frozen by primary owner." Elaine stepped closer. "Primary owner. That's you, isn't it?" Richard clicked again, his jaw tightening. "It should be." Ryan leaned over his shoulder. "Then why does it say Emily Carter?" The name glowed on the screen, plain as daylight. Primary account owner, Emily Carter. No one spoke for a long moment. Only the quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the space. Elaine whispered, "That can't be right." Ryan's voice cracked. She froze everything. Richard's hand tightened on the mouse. "Impossible. She wouldn't know how." "She works in finance," Ryan said. "She knows exactly how." Richard stood abruptly, knocking over his coffee. It spilled across the marble counter, dark against the white surface. He didn't even notice. "I'll call the bank." Elaine watched him fumble with his phone, her hand trembling slightly. "Richard, maybe we should just—" "Don't start," he snapped. He dialed the number for the bank's hotline. After a few robotic menu options, a woman's voice answered. "Thank you for calling Westbridge Bank. This is Sandra. How can I help you?" "This is Richard Carter," he barked. "My account's been frozen without authorization. I need it fixed immediately." "Yes, Mr. Carter," she said, polite and calm. "Let me pull up your information." He waited. Breathing hard, his fingers tapping the counter. After a moment, her voice returned neutral, but firm. "Sir, I see here that the account is registered under the primary ownership of Emily Carter. The freeze request was submitted internally with the proper authorization codes." What his voice rose. "She can't. This is my family account." "I'm sorry, sir, but our system indicates she is the legal account holder. Any action taken is within her right." Richard's voice broke into a near shout. "I want to speak to your supervisor." "Of course," the woman said, but her tone stayed flat. "However, it's a federal holiday. Supervisors will be available tomorrow morning." He hung up mid-sentence and slammed the phone down. The sound echoed through the kitchen. Elaine's voice was barely a whisper. "Richard, she's frozen us out!" He turned on her. "You gave her that access. You and your damn spending. Don't you dare blame this on me!" She snapped the tremor in her hands, now replaced by anger. "You're the one who let her handle the finances. You told me it was convenient. It was supposed to be controlled," he said, pacing. "Not hijacked." Ryan sat down on the couch, head in his hands. "What do we do now?" Richard glared at him. "You call your sister. Fix this. She listens to you." Ryan looked up, startled. "She hates me. And after what just happened this morning, then make her not hate you." Richard growled. Elaine crossed her arms. "Maybe we should just talk to her calmly. She's probably upset." "She's not upset," Richard said, his voice cold. "She's making a point." The three of them stood there, surrounded by the quiet chaos of their perfect home. The Christmas tree lights blinked in the corner, reflecting off the spilled coffee on the counter. Outside, the wind howled. Elaine finally broke the silence. "Maybe she's right," she said softly. "Maybe we went too far." Richard turned to her slowly, his expression dark. "You're taking her side, I'm saying. She has a reason," Elaine whispered. "She's been paying for everything. Maybe she just had enough." Richard's eyes narrowed, fury tightening every line of his face. "She's declared war on her own family." Elaine looked down, her voice trembling. "No, Richard. She just stopped pretending it was one." For a long moment, no one moved. The ticking clock in the hallway seemed louder than before. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Inside that house, everything that had been built on image and money began to crack inch by inch under the weight of their own denial. And while they scrambled to explain the chaos, I sat miles away in a quiet cafe watching the snowfall and knowing exactly what they were discovering now. For years, I'd funded their illusion. Today, I repossessed reality. The next morning, the city was still half asleep under a blanket of gray. The roads were slick with slush, and my breath came out in pale clouds as I crossed the street toward the glass facade of Westbridge Bank. My office building looked sterile in the winter light, cold, efficient, exactly how I felt walking into it. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, releasing the faint scent of coffee and disinfectant. Grace Miller was already in the lobby waiting for me, a steaming paper cup in hand. She looked like she hadn't slept much either, though her lipstick and blazer made it seem like she had everything under control. That was Grace. Clean edges, calm voice, sharp mind. "You sure you want to go through with this?" she asked, handing me the coffee. "They're your parents." I took a slow sip. The bitterness felt grounding. "I'm sure," I said. "This isn't revenge, it's correction." Her mouth twitched like she wanted to argue, but knew better. "Come on," she said instead. "Nathan's already waiting." The elevator ride up was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. I stared at my reflection in the mirrored doors. Hair pulled back, dark circles under my eyes, a thin coat of resolve over exhaustion. I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. The legal floor was deserted, except for Nathan Brooks, the bank's compliance lawyer, sitting behind a desk stacked with files. He stood when we walked in, straightening his tie. "Morning, Emily." Grace filled me in a little. I nodded, setting my folder on the table. "Then you know why I'm here." He glanced at Grace, then at me. "Technically," he said carefully, "your father could sue for interference. Freezing those accounts. It's a big move, even if it's legally yours." I unzipped the folder and slid a stack of documents across the desk. Then he'll have to explain under oath why he forged my signature 3 years ago. Grace frowned. "Wait, what?" I pulled out the top sheet. "Here, a personal loan from First Continental Realty, dated August 2020. I was listed as guarantor. That's my name, my social security number, my supposed signature." I tapped the page. "But I was in Chicago that week at a corporate audit conference. I have the flight receipts to prove it." Nathan adjusted his glasses, scanning the document. "Jesus," he muttered. "This is blatant." "Yeah," I said. "He used my name to secure $200,000 against one of his properties. Then he defaulted. I paid the penalties because I didn't even know about it until the notices came through my credit history last year." Grace sighed, leaning back. "Emily," she rubbed her forehead, "you should have told me. I thought I could handle it quietly. I thought maybe it was a mistake. You know how you tell yourself stories to keep loving people. Neither of them said anything." Grace's expression softened, but Nathan looked furious on my behalf. Grace finally spoke. You're protecting yourself, Emily. Don't apologize for that. I gave a small, tired smile. I'm not sorry anymore. Nathan cleared his throat. If he did sign these, that's fraud, plain and simple. You're covered legally for everything you've done since freezing the accounts. But I recommend keeping all correspondence formal. No more personal calls. That won't be a problem. I said. Grace folded her arms. What do you want to do next? I just want distance, I said. The kind that can't be erased with guilt trips or Sunday brunch invitations. Grace gave a half smile. That's poetic. Cold, but poetic. We spent another hour going over statements and internal protocols. Nathan made copies, cataloged the evidence, and assured me the bank's internal record would support any inquiry. Grace sat quietly for most of it, occasionally glancing at me like she was measuring how much I had left in me. When everything was signed and sealed, she stood and said, "You want to get breakfast? Or maybe a drink, given the circumstances. I'm fine," I said, gathering the papers. Really. I just need some air. As I walked toward the exit, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I almost ignored it, but old habits die hard. A voicemail notification. The name on the screen made my throat tighten. Dad. I hesitated, then pressed play. His voice filled my ear, raw and angry. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you'll regret this. You hear me? You don't freeze out your family, Emily. You fix it. You fix it now. He paused long enough for me to hear the tremor in his breath. You're still my daughter. Don't make me treat you like an enemy. The message ended with the sound of him slamming something. A door, maybe a glass. I stopped walking and just stood there, the weight of his words echoing in my head. Then I deleted the message, without saving it. In the lobby, the morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the swirl of snow still falling outside. I stepped through the revolving doors and into the cold. The air bit at my face, but it felt cleaner than anything I'd breathed in days. My heels crunched against the salted sidewalk as I started walking toward the parking lot. I could still hear my father's voice in my head, but it sounded smaller now, like a threat shouted from too far away to matter. The thing about threats, they sound smaller in the snow. The night fell heavy and sharp, the kind of cold that made glass glitter harder and the sky seem endless. Downtown Bellevue looked like a scene from a holiday movie, gold lights spilling out of hotels and restaurants. Black cars idling at curbs, people stepping out in furs and suits. My mother loved nights like this. They were her arena. The Bellevue Women's League Charity Gala was the event of the season, and Elaine Carter had every intention of reminding people why she was one of its longest-standing members. She arrived early, draped in a dark green gown, diamonds at her neck, and a smile practiced to perfection. Always flawless, Margaret Hill said as she swept up to greet her, air-kissing both cheeks. If I didn't know better, I'd think you had a personal lighting crew following you around. Flattery will get you everywhere, my mother replied, her voice smooth as silk. The ballroom was a sea of sequins and champagne. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above rows of tables lined with silverware that gleamed like it had been polished by angels. A jazz trio played near the stage, soft enough not to interrupt the hum of moneyed conversation. My mother was in her element, laughing, gesturing, touching elbows, her confidence restored after the chaos of the morning. At the donation counter, she pulled her platinum card from her clutch, smiling at the young attendant in a sequined blazer. "Let's make this a good year," she said lightly. 10,000 to the Children's Fund. The attendant's eyes widened just a little. "Generous as always, Mrs. Carter." He slid the card into the reader. The machine beeped. Declined. He frowned, trying again. Beep. Declined. Elaine blinked, still smiling. "That's odd. Must be the network. Try again, would you?" He tried again. Same result. Now the smile on her face felt tight, stretched like glass about to crack. "I'm sure it's fine. It's Christmas, the systems are probably slow," she said. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the attendant whispered, leaning in slightly. "It's not authorized." For a moment, no one else noticed, but then Margaret, who had been chatting beside her, caught the tension in the air. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Just a technical issue," Elaine said quickly, forcing a laugh, but Margaret's eyebrow lifted the smallest flicker of curiosity crossing her face. Around them, a few heads turned whispers, starting like ripples in a pond. Elaine felt the heat rise to her cheeks. Her phone buzzed inside her clutch. She stepped away from the counter, pretending to check her messages, as if none of it mattered. On the screen was a text from Richard. Emily froze everything. Her fingers trembled so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Across town, Richard Carter was pushing through the glass doors of Westbridge Bank. The lobby was mostly empty. Christmas night didn't invite customers, but a single security guard looked up from his desk, startled by the storm of a man in a cashmere coat barreling toward him. "I need to see Emily Carter!" Richard barked, slapping his ID on the counter. "Now!" The guard blinked. "Sir, the offices are closed. It's Christmas. I don't care what day it is. She works here. I saw her car in the garage." The guard hesitated, then reached for his phone to call upstairs. "I can check, but Richard was already moving his shoes, echoing across the marble as he strode toward the elevators. The guard caught up, intercepting him just as the doors opened. "Sir, please. You can't go up without authorization." "Authorization," Richard snapped. "She's my daughter." Through the glass walls of the mezzanine level, he saw movement. Emily in a meeting room with two colleagues. Calm, composed, focused. She was looking at documents, talking softly, her expression unreadable. He stood there, heart pounding, watching her behind that transparent wall that somehow felt impenetrable. He raised his voice loud enough for the echo to carry. "You're humiliating your own family." His voice filled the lobby. A receptionist looked up from her desk. Grace Miller, standing beside me, put a hand on my arm. I didn't move. I didn't look down. I just kept speaking to Nathan, finishing the sentence I was in the middle of. The sound of his shouting faded behind the glass like it belonged to another world. He thought silence was surrender. He never learned it could be defiance. When Richard realized I wasn't reacting, his face hardened. The guard guided him gently toward the door. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "Fine," he muttered, straightening his coat. "But she'll regret this." Back at the gala, Elaine's humiliation was complete. Margaret avoided her, now murmuring to another woman near the champagne fountain. The whispers had turned into knowing smiles, subtle and sharp. "Oh, poor Elaine," someone said behind her. "That family's always been complicated." She grabbed her wrap and left before dessert was served, heels clicking too loudly on the marble floors. The cold air outside hit her like a slap. She stood on the curb, trying to steady her breathing as her phone buzzed again. Another message from Richard. "She won't answer me. I saw her at the bank. She's pretending we don't exist." Elaine typed a reply, then deleted it. Her fingers were too numb to find the words. A black car pulled up, the driver opening the door for her. She got in, staring out the window as the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and blue. By the time Richard got home, the driveway was buried under a new layer of snow. He parked beside the Tesla, useless now without its active insurance, and sat there in silence, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Elaine was waiting inside, still in her gown, a glass of untouched champagne trembling in her hand. Neither of them spoke when their eyes met. The house, usually filled with holiday music, was silent. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and relentless, covering everything. For people like them, silence was always the enemy. But for me, it was the sound of freedom. The city was half asleep by the time I got home. My apartment sat high above downtown, the kind of space people call minimal, but really just means quiet. Snow pressed against the windows like a white curtain, muffling the noise below. The glow from the streetlights flickered across my walls, soft and cold. I kicked off my boots, peeled off my coat, and sank into the couch without turning on the lights. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, small, fake, undecorated. Just a few strings of white lights and nothing else. It looked lonely, but it was mine. The phone on the table started to vibrate. Once, then again. I didn't look at it. After the third time I picked it up, the screen lit up with the word Dad. I stared at it, the name glowing like a ghost in the dark. I let it ring until it stopped. 10 seconds later, it started again. Same name, same sound. I set it face down and pulled the blanket around my shoulders. A few minutes passed before it buzzed again. Mom, then Ryan, then Dad again. I counted without meaning to. 7 calls in 10 minutes. By the time the clock on the oven blinked 10 p.m., the tally was at 15. By midnight, 29. Each time it rang, the same vibration echoed through the quiet room, blending with the sound of snow brushing the glass. The church bells from St. James Cathedral drifted faintly through the cold air, distant, solemn, almost kind. Together, they made a strange duet, wrath and fury. I stared at the phone. The calls came one after another like waves hitting the shore. For years it had been the other way around. I was the one trying to be heard. I was the one apologizing first, smoothing things over, pretending everything was fine. But not tonight. For once, they were the ones asking for attention. For once, I had the choice not to answer. I reached over and flipped the phone back over. The screen flashed again, illuminating the table dad. I could almost hear his voice in my head, the tone he used when he wanted obedience, but called it love. "I'm your father, Emily. Don't talk back," I whispered to the empty room. Not anymore. The light from the phone dimmed and disappeared. The sound stopped, but the echo lingered like the air still remembered. The bells rang again outside, faint but steady. My body relaxed for the first time all day. I stared at the tree, the soft white lights reflecting in my coffee cup. No ornaments, no ribbons, no pretense. Just light. A memory came uninvited. The smell of sawdust and oil from my father's garage, the rhythmic clink of tools. I must have been 12. He was tightening something on his old Chevy and said, "Control your emotions." Emily, weakness costs respect. He'd meant it as advice. At the time, I thought he was right. Now it sounded like a warning. He taught me control, but not compassion. He taught me how to stand still while someone yelled, how to smile when something hurt, how to keep my voice even, when my hands shook. All those lessons had built me into someone he could no longer manipulate. "You taught me control, Dad," I said softly. "I just learned it better." Another call came through. Number 29. I picked up the phone this time, just long enough to watch it ring. His name filled the screen again. For a second, I thought about answering. Not to argue, not to explain, just to tell him the truth. That he couldn't scare me anymore. That I wasn't the same daughter he used to silence with guilt, but I didn't. Instead, I pressed the side button, silencing it. The room fell quiet again, the only sound the faint hum of the heater and the bells outside. I closed my eyes. The phone kept buzzing once every few minutes, even on silent. Tiny vibrations against the wood like a heartbeat that refused to die down. I could picture him pacing the living room, veins in his neck bulging, my mother sitting on the couch, crying Ryan somewhere between guilt and denial. I could picture every scene without being there. I leaned my head back against the couch and exhaled slowly. The air in my apartment felt warmer, lighter, even though the world outside was frozen. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I owed them an explanation. I got up and walked to the window. From this height, the city looked soft and distant, blanketed in white. Cars crawled through the streets below like slow-moving lights. The bells tolled one last time, the sound fading into the wind. I stood there until the last vibration stopped. Then I turned the phone face down again, letting it rest where it was. I didn't need to hear anything more tonight. I closed my eyes and let the silence take over, the rhythm of the bells still echoing faintly in my mind. Control, he'd said. He was right about one thing. Control is power. But tonight, for the first time, it belonged to me. 1 week later, the sky over Seattle was the color of tin. From my office window on the 20th floor, I watched the city wake up in slow motion. Traffic crawling through wet streets, people bundled in coats, coffee cups steaming in their hands. The holidays were over, but the air still carried that heavy, post-celebration quiet. I had just finished replying to an email when I saw the reflection of someone standing behind me. A tall man in a dark overcoat badge glinting near his chest. Emily Carter. I turned. Yes. He held up his credentials. Detective Lee Porter, Financial Crimes Division. "Do you have a minute?" The words were calm, but they landed heavy. I gestured for him to sit. Of course. He took the seat across from my desk, setting a slim folder down between us. "I'm investigating a company called Aurora Tech. I understand your brother Ryan Carter is listed as its founder and majority shareholder." My stomach tightened. "Yes, that's correct." He flipped open the folder. "We've been alerted to multiple irregularities in the company's investment activity. Funds moving from private credit lines into business accounts, unreported income, potential securities fraud." The phrase, securities fraud, echoed in my head, sharp and clinical. "You're saying Ryan's under federal review, his company is," Porter said evenly. "We're still determining the scope of involvement. I'm here because some of the transfers originated from accounts in your name." "I see," I said, keeping my voice steady. He studied me for a beat. "I'm not here to accuse you, Ms. Carter. I just need context." "Of course." I opened my computer, logged into the secured database, and pulled up the archived financials. I showed him the same thing I'd shown Grace and Nathan days before, records of transactions that tied directly from my mother's credit line to Ryan's startup account. Dates, amounts, digital signatures, all of it as clear as day. Porter glanced through the files, nodding slowly. This helps. These transfers, they match what we're seeing on our end. We'll likely need statements from the bank to verify authorization. You'll have my full cooperation, I said. But those charges weren't mine. I froze them the night before Christmas. His brow lifted slightly. That was you, yeah. He closed the folder. Then you probably saved yourself a world of trouble. I leaned back in my chair. I've been told that before. He stood, buttoning his coat. We'll be in touch if we need anything else. For what it's worth, Ms. Carter, it's rare to see someone clean up a mess like this before it spreads. When he left, the office felt too quiet again. I stared out the window, watching the clouds drift over the sound. Somewhere across town, my family was probably unraveling in real time. I didn't have to imagine it for long. Elaine Carter stood in her kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear, pacing. Richard, they froze my personal credit. I can't even pay the housekeeper. On the other end, Richard's voice was raw with frustration. Stop calling me about cards, Elaine. I have lawyers breathing down my neck. I didn't do anything wrong, she shouted. They said the account's under investigation. Do you know what that means? Do you have any idea how that looks? Richard snapped. You wanted her to handle the finances, remember? Well, congratulations. She handled them. Elaine slammed the phone down on the counter, her diamond bracelet clattering against the granite. The house was silent again, the only sound the faint buzz of the refrigerator. She stood there staring at her reflection in the dark window until her composure cracked. Back at my office, Grace knocked on the door. Hey, she said softly, holding out a cup of coffee. You missed the morning meeting. I know I said taking it from her. Just catching up. She hesitated, then nodded toward my desk. You saw it, didn't you? I followed her gaze. The Seattle Chronicle was lying on top of my paperwork, headlines splashed across the front, family ties and financial lies, the Carter case. Beneath it, a photo. Richard Carter outside Westbridge Bank shouting at someone off camera. My name was buried halfway down the article described as a senior financial officer cooperating with authorities. Grace frowned. I can't believe they ran it with that title. I said. I reached for the paper, folded it neatly in half, and dropped it into the trash. They love a scandal. Grace's eyes lingered on me. You really okay? I shrugged. There's no satisfaction in being right, you know. Just quiet. Outside, snow had started again, drifting sideways against the glass. The flakes caught the morning light, faint but steady. Grace followed my gaze. You okay? She asked again, gentler this time. Getting there, I said. She smiled softly, squeezed my shoulder and left. I sat alone, listening to the faint hum of the building and the muted city beyond. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, then faded. The air in my office smelled like coffee and cold air leaking through old vents. When you build your life on borrowed money and borrowed morals, eventually the bill arrives. The snow thickened, blurring the skyline, until the city disappeared, completely behind white. I watched it fall for a long time, neither happy nor sad, just suspended in that rare stillness that comes after everything breaks, and before anything new begins. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for their call. The new year began, gray and wet, as if Seattle itself was trying to wash away the mess December had left behind. At Westbridge Bank, the holiday decorations were gone, replaced by neat stacks of case files and the smell of burnt coffee. Grace's office looked like a war room, papers spread across her desk, 2 empty mugs beside her keyboard, and a corkboard filled with printed news clippings about the Carter investigation. I sat across from her, a folder in my lap, the same one that had followed me through every stage of this unraveling. She took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. All right, she said finally. We need to make it official. You should cooperate directly with the Financial Crimes Division. Hand over everything. It's the only way to seal legal protection and clear your name completely. I'd been expecting this. I opened the folder and slid the documents toward her. Everything's in here. The loan papers, the digital logs, the emails from his broker. If they need it, they can have it. Grace hesitated before taking them. You sure? Yes, you did the right thing. You know, she said quietly. You're not destroying your family. You're saving yourself. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. Maybe those things can't happen at the same time. She sighed and leaned back. You sound like me after my divorce. I'll take that as a compliment, I said. We both laughed, but it faded quickly. Grace slid the folder into a manila envelope, sealed it, and marked it with a red label. She picked up her phone. I'll courier this to the division myself. Once they process it, you're officially out of the line of fire. I nodded, feeling the strange weight of relief and regret at once. Across town, my father sat in a different office, one that smelled of leather and frustration. His lawyer, a thin man with silver hair, was flipping through paperwork with clinical precision. Richard, he said, his voice low but sharp. I need you to understand what this means. The investigation into Aurora Tech now includes the 2020 loan, your loan. The one you filed under your daughter's name. Richard shifted in his chair. It was a formality, a temporary guarantor. She knew about it. The lawyer looked up, unimpressed. Did she sign it? Richard hesitated. She didn't say no. That's not a yes, the lawyer replied. If she talks, you're done. They'll see it as deliberate misrepresentation. You could be facing charges. Richard stared out the window, watching rain streak down the glass. She won't talk, he muttered. She's my daughter. The lawyer closed the folder. If you're so sure, maybe call her. Settle this privately before someone else decides for you. That night, as the rain turned into sleet, my phone lit up with a number I still recognized by heart. I let it ring twice before answering. Emily. My father's voice said, measured but tense. Maybe we should meet. Settle this privately. No lawyers, no press. Just family. I kept my tone even. There's nothing left to settle. He exhaled sharply like I'd just insulted him. I'm trying to fix this. Fixing it would have meant not breaking it in the first place. Silence. I could almost hear the sound of him gripping the phone too tightly. Emily, he said finally, his voice dropping into something almost pleading. You don't want to make enemies out of blood. I'm not your enemy, I said softly. I'm just not your victim anymore. I hung up before he could respond. The next morning, my boss, Tom Sanders, called me into his office. Tom was the kind of man who rarely smiled, but when he did, it usually meant something was about to change. His desk was buried under audit reports and a half-eaten blueberry muffin. Sit, he said, motioning to the chair. I've been watching how you handled everything these past few weeks. Chaos doesn't even begin to describe it, but you turned it into compliance. That's not easy. I blinked, unsure how to respond. Thank you, he nodded. We're launching a new fraud prevention unit. I want you to lead it. Full authority, new team, your own office. For a second, I didn't breathe. Are you serious? Completely? He smiled faintly. You've earned it. And after the press coverage, the bank needs a win. You're our win. When I left his office, the envelope Grace had sent the day before was already logged into the federal system. My father's forged loan, my brother's fake company, my mother's debt. They were all on record now, bound by something no apology could erase. I walked down the hall toward the corner office Tom had mentioned. It was still empty boxes stacked against the walls, a blank nameplate waiting by the door. I stood there for a moment, staring at the skyline through the wide glass window. The winter sunlight was cutting through the fog, hitting the tops of the skyscrapers like a spotlight. Justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it hands you a new keycard. I slid my ID through the reader. The door clicked open. The room smelled of new carpet and paint, clean and unused. My reflection stared back at me from the glass wall, and for once I didn't see the daughter who'd been blamed, or the sister who'd been used, or the woman who'd been told to keep quiet. For the first time, my name meant something only I owned. I set my bag on the desk, opened the blinds, and let the light in. Ease. The air was cold enough to sting when I stepped outside that morning. January sunlight had a way of making everything look cleaner, sharper, like the world had pressed a reset button overnight. I drove with the windows cracked just enough to feel the air on my face heading east toward Lake Washington. The city was still half asleep, pale light stretching over the water. Across town, in a quiet corner of Capitol Hill, Richard Carter was already awake. He walked slowly up the stone steps of St. John's Church, his breath visible in the winter air. The doors were unlocked, the sanctuary empty except for Father Michael arranging candles near the altar. "Good morning," the priest said softly, glancing up. "You're early." Richard hesitated near the pews, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "I just needed to be somewhere quiet." Father Michael gave a small nod and gestured for him to sit. Then you came to the right place. The old man sat down heavily, the wood creaking under his weight. He stared at the stained glass ahead, the one with the lamb and the shepherd, and said almost to himself, I just wanted to protect the family's reputation. Father Michael didn't move. And what did it cost you? Richard's jaw clenched. My daughter thinks I'm a monster. Do you? He looked down, fingers lacing together. I did what I thought was right. I kept things running, paid the bills, held it together. Someone had to. The priest's voice stayed calm. You kept the name, he said quietly. You lost the people. Richard looked up, the words landing heavier than he expected. At the same hour, I was walking along the path that bordered the lake, crunching frost beneath my boots. The air smelled like cedar and salt, clean and biting. Michael Lawson walked beside me, hands stuffed in his jacket, the same easy grin I remembered from college still on his face. Hard to believe we used to run laps around here hungover, he said, smiling. You've changed, Carter. Good or bad? I asked. He thought for a second. Different. Lighter, I think. Like someone who finally put the past down. I kicked a pebble toward the frozen edge of the lake, watching it slide over the thin layer of ice. I didn't put it down, I said. I just stopped carrying what wasn't mine. He nodded, quiet for a moment. That's a better kind of freedom. The sunlight hit the water, scattering across the ice like glass breaking in slow motion. I stopped walking and watched it. The sound of small waves against the shore was steady, rhythmic. For a second, everything in me went still. Across town, my father knelt in confession. His voice trembled as he spoke to the quiet space between them. I hurt people I love. I lied. I made excuses. Father Michael's voice was soft, almost gentle. The thing about confession is, it's not about erasing what you've done. It's about facing it. I don't know if I can fix it, Richard said. Maybe you can't, the priest replied. But you can stop making it worse. In that moment, somewhere between the echo of his words and the cold air filling the church, something in him broke quietly, like ice giving way beneath too much weight. Back by the lake, Michael handed me a cup of coffee from the stand near the pier. Still black, right? He asked. I smiled. Always. He studied me for a second. You ever going to talk to him again? I don't know, I said. Maybe some things are better left in the silence they created. We kept walking until the wind turned sharper, and our breath came out in clouds. The city behind us was waking up. The sound of cars, the faint hum of construction somewhere in the distance. Life moving on as it always does. We stopped near the pier railing, the water beneath it rippling where the ice had started to thaw. The light reflected in every direction, too bright to look at for long. We think closure comes with forgiveness. Sometimes it just comes with quiet. My phone buzzed in my pocket. For a moment, I considered ignoring it like before. But something made me check this time. The message was short. Dad, I'm sorry. I stood there, thumb hovering over the screen, the wind catching strands of my hair and pulling them across my face. Michael glanced over. Everything okay? Yeah, I said. Just unexpected. He didn't ask more, and I didn't offer. I looked back at the lake, the sunlight glinting off the ice like tiny mirrors. I smiled faintly and locked the screen. Sometimes silence really is the answer. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, the sound of the water mixing with the cold wind. The ice cracked softly near the shore, breaking apart under the sun. It didn't shatter. It just opened, slowly, naturally, making space for something new underneath. By late February, the snow had begun to lose its hold on the city. It melted into silver puddles along the curbs, reflecting the glow of traffic lights, and the faint shimmer of a sky trying to remember spring. From my office window, the view of downtown Seattle looked softer, like someone had taken the edge off everything sharp. I closed my laptop, the hum of the building fading into evening quiet. The new office still felt strange sometimes, too clean, too empty, but it was mine. I hung my badge on the hook beside the door, slipped on my coat, and dialed Grace as I walked toward the elevator. She picked up on the second ring. Tell me you're not still working. It's Friday. I'm not, I said. I'm actually calling to tell you I'm taking some time off. Grace sounded half shocked, half proud. Vacation. You do I need to mark the calendar? Yeah, I said, smiling. Just me, the mountains, and silence. She laughed. Well, you've earned it. Try not to audit the forest. I'll do my best. When I stepped outside, the cold hit gently, not cruelly like before. The city was alive again. Families carrying shopping bags, couples laughing under umbrellas, street musicians playing soft jazz at the corner of Pine and 4th. The smell of roasted chestnuts mixed with car exhaust and rain. For the first time in months, I felt like I was part of the world instead of standing apart from it. I walked without hurry, letting the rhythm of the city pull me along. Every light, every sound felt new. Life, it seemed, had decided to move on, and I was finally catching up. The snowmelt trickled into gutters, turning the asphalt into a mirror that caught pieces of the night. Headlights neon the blur of passing strangers. I thought of how fast everything had changed, how destruction, when done right, can feel like renovation. Somewhere across town, my father sat in his half-empty house, the grand silence swallowing everything he once filled with noise. The framed family photos still lined the hallway, but the smiles in them looked foreign now, like people who'd been pretending for the camera. He made himself a drink, left it untouched, and stared at the phone that hadn't rung in days. Elaine, meanwhile, sat in a boutique downtown, handing over her jewelry, one piece at a time. The clerk weighed the gold bracelets, her engagement ring, the diamond necklace she'd once worn to every gala. The total flashed on the calculator, and she nodded without arguing. Later that week, she stood before the door of the Bellevue Women's League, unhooked her nameplate from the wall, and slipped it into her purse. And Ryan, my brother, who had built his empire out of buzzwords and borrowed money, was escorted out of his glass office by 2 federal investigators. He didn't fight, just walked out into the rain, the reflection of flashing lights rippling in the puddles at his feet. Karma doesn't knock. It just waits until you open the wrong door. The city kept moving, unaware, unbothered. But I noticed the way the snow softened everything, the way it covered the evidence of what came before without ever erasing it completely. I reached the pedestrian bridge that stretched across the bay. The air there always smelled like salt and wind. Below, the water glowed faintly from the streetlights, black and silver and endless. I leaned against the railing, breathing in the cold. A few stray flakes drifted down from the sky, lazy and slow, melting before they even hit the ground. I caught one on my glove and watched it dissolve. That Christmas, I didn't lose my family. I lost my silence. And that was freedom. The city lights blurred through the mist, glowing like they'd been painted on the horizon. Somewhere out there, my family was learning how to live without the version of me that used to hold them together. And me, I was learning how to live without the need to fix everything I didn't break. I stood there for a long time listening to the sound of the water, the hum of cars behind me, and the faint laughter from people walking past. The world didn't stop for my story. It just kept moving as it should. I smiled, just a small, quiet thing, and let the night take it. If you've ever been hurt by the people who were supposed to protect you, remember. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing you'll ever say, and sometimes justice arrives dressed in snow.